Hello, it's Jeffrey Christian of CPM Group. It's about 12:45 on the afternoon of November 1st here in New York. We've made it into November. I wanted to talk about some of the longer-term big political issues that the world faces that will have a major effect on gold and silver prices, and really have had a major effect on gold and silver prices for 40 years, 30 years, possibly longer. But given that it's now November 1st and we are in the first of 2 days of the FOMC meeting, that will probably lead to a significant increase in U.S. Interest rates. I think I should also pay some attention to shorter term trends. Now, as we can see here, and as we all painfully know, the prices of gold and silver have fallen really since the first half of this year, first quarter of this year. They've gotten to low levels, perhaps lower than even we thought. We were thinking about 1630 as a low, and I think it got down to about 1624 for gold. Silver, at one point we thought it might hold above $19 or $18, but it has gotten very low. Today they've spiked up a little bit, but gold spiked up to 1660, and silver actually got to our short-term target of $20 before backing off, but it's basically around $19.79 as we speak. Our expectations had been that the prices would fall during the summer, that they could stay relatively weak in September, but then start rising over the course of the fourth quarter. October's behind us now, and the prices really haven't started rising. There are a number of economic factors, which I spoke about in last Friday's video, and a lot of political factors that lead us to believe that the prices will bottom out and they will start rising. Our expectation is that they will be relatively modest increases over the course of 2023, but that as the political and economic environments devolve, you'll get to a point where investors will come back in large volumes, buying gold and silver, and the prices will rise perhaps sharply. But again, our expectation is that that might be more than a year away from now. On a short-term basis, there are really three big political topics or issues that we think are particularly relevant. There are many others too, and we could nitpick all day and talk about the UK and the Italian election and the future of Europe. But I think the big three are the US elections, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the aftermath of the Chinese Communist Party Congress, which ended last week. Of course, as I said earlier, we do have a Federal Reserve Open Market Committee meeting today and tomorrow, and they will make an announcement tomorrow, November 2nd. Our expectation, along with the consensus in the broader economic world, is probably a 75 basis point increase. There are a growing number of people who think it might be 50 basis points. And then in the gold bug community, there are people talking about how the Fed might have to lower interest rates tomorrow, which seems highly unlikely to everybody in the mainstream markets. But the big factor right now is the U.S. midterm elections, which are next week. We're not quite sure how they'll shake out, and we're not sure how they will affect precious metals markets. But there will be some uncertainty around them. We think that regardless of the outcome, you're going to see continued stalemate in the U.S. government, and that will be bad for the economy and bad for the world. So that's one factor. The Russian invasion of Ukraine continues, and what's happening on the battlefront is important. But as we've said recently, in recent weeks and months, what's happening in Moscow at the Kremlin probably is much more important to the ultimate resolution of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Our expectation is that there'll be some major changes in the political structure of Russia, and that Russia has been defanged for a long period of time in terms of its international stature. Communist Party of China had its 5-year Congress. Xi Jinping was reelected president. Um, Most moderates were removed from the Standing Committee and the Politburo, the Central Committee, which bodes poorly for the future of China. And it also suggests that you may see even worse economic conditions in China over the next year or two, and continued political issues. So those are three shorter term factors, or rather, they're not short term factors, but they're factors that will affect gold and silver in the short term. But what I really wanted to talk about were these longer term factors. And I have 3 years here, 1990, 2000, and 2022. In 1989, the communist governments of Eastern Europe fell, and those countries started moving to various degrees of economic and political reform. At the same time, the Soviet Union withdrew its troops from Afghanistan. Its 10-year incursion into Afghanistan was the single most important factor that led to the destruction and dissolution of the Soviet Union. It destroyed the economy. It hurt the country in terms of its international status. It left many, many Russians dead. It left many Russian families embittered. And it brought home a lot of people who were severely injured and who were addicted to heroin and opium, which had major negative consequences for Russian Soviet society. At the end of 1989, there was a view that peace was breaking out in the world. And there were books about the end of history and how we were moving to a unipolar superpower structure that was going to usher in peace and prosperity forever. I was asked to write a speech for Fraser Fell, who was the chairman of Placer Dome at the time. And the speech I wrote, basically the theme was, yes, the world is more peaceful now and safer than it was even, a few years ago. But there were 5 major areas that we outlined and said, these are issues to watch out for. One was the future of China, which was at that point 10, 15 years into its economic reform period under Deng Xiaoping. Mao and Zhou Enlai had passed away, I believe, in 1975. China was changing. It was changing in a way that was good for China, good for Chinese people, and good for the world. Second thing was Russia, which we called the Soviet Union back then, and the headlong move to dissolution of that Soviet empire. And that would have global implications economically and as well as politically. The European Union was just now, at that time, 1989, you saw the euro and the European Central Bank begin. The European Union was moving toward greater economic and political concentration. The European Union's bureaucracy was growing enormously, and that posed problems because in the late 1980s, you saw a major shift in the way people thought about government, but government leaders hadn't. From the 1930s through the Depression and World War II, and then the Cold War and the nuclear threats, you had seen an impulse toward greater political centralization. By the mid-1980s, you started seeing people moving toward greater political decentralization. But in many parts of the world, China, the Soviet Union, the United States, Europe, you saw the governments and the government leaders continuing to move toward centralization. This was a trend that had been going on for 50 years, and it was hard to change the direction of the bureaucratic arc of development, even as the people were saying, no, given technological changes and other changes and societal changes, we want greater autonomy devolved to smaller political units. And so we said the European Union is moving toward greater centralization now, but the people want greater decentralization, and that could cause some problems. The United States, we said, had a lot of political problems that would only grow worse over time. And then we pointed out the Islamic world, from Morocco to Indonesia, more than 1 billion people, many of whom were oppressed because of political or religious or social or ethnic reasons by autocratic governments. And those autocratic governments were largely supported by the United States and to a lesser extent the United Kingdom and France. And we said that was a tinderbox that was going to blow up. About 8 months later, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and there was talk about Fraser Fell running for parliament in Canada. He didn't. He said that he would try to get me as his speechwriter if he did. But this was the situation in 1990. A more peaceful world, but with major problems hanging out over most of the world. In 2000, in November of 2000, almost 22 years ago to the day, we issued a buy recommendation on gold. We said that we thought the world was a more treacherous place than it had been even in 1978, 1980, when the gold price was driven from $200, less than $200 to $850 on an intraday basis. We reiterated those 5 factors and probably added a few others. There were economic and financial market issues as well. And there was the opening up of economies, and people were gaining the ability to take care of themselves economically as they never had before in Russia and the Soviet Union, post-Soviet, post-communist Eastern Europe. Parts of Latin America were liberalizing, parts of Africa were liberalizing. African leaders who had leaned towards socialism in the immediate post-colonial period were shifting away to more market economy structures. China was moving toward greater freedom in terms of economic activity. And you saw an increase in increments of investment demand for gold and silver in India, in Japan, in China, around the world. And we thought that that, combined with more hostile economic and political factors, would cause more people to buy more gold for a longer period of time than ever before. Economically speaking, an upward shift in the investment demand curve. That indeed happened, and between 2002 and 2013, more investors in more parts of the world bought more gold at higher prices than ever before in the history of mankind. They bought more gold than the 350 million ounces that were estimated to be held by private investors circa 1966. So what we thought was an issue on the horizon in 1990 was right on the horizon in 2000. And it's even more, it's right on top of us in 2022. Those same factors are still there. The future of China, which seemed assured in 1990 and 2000, is now called into question. Russia is going to be an issue for some time to come, but it has allowed itself to be sucked into a war that will sharply diminish its economic power and its stature on the world stage for years, if not decades to come. The European Union is now facing that greater decentralization tactic, and you're seeing with the election of people like the new prime minister in Italy, increased interest in trying to find a way to convince the European Union bureaucracy to accept a decentralization that it refused to accept and think about, even just on a limited basis, when Prime Minister Cameron of the UK approached it many years ago and said, look, 5,000-page constitution for the EU, this is becoming unworkable. We need some relief here. And the EU management said no. So he came back, had a referendum. The result was Brexit. And just incredible British prime ministerships ever since that time. Boris Johnson, Liz Truss. There's a theory that this was some sort of conspiracy by the U.S. government to make it look good by contrasting it to what was going on in England. England now is looking at a situation where there may be votes on disunification in Scotland and in Northern Ireland in the year or years ahead. England probably will lose 10% of its growth potential because of its move into Brexit, and possibly even more now because of some of the missteps that the Tory party has led. England, like so many other countries, I won't name any that might be having an election next week, doesn't seem to have a legitimate political party or two that could possibly efficiently lead it forward. And then within the European Union, you have to think that there could be major re-engineering of what the European Union is. The United States speaks for itself. It is incredibly disunited, and there doesn't seem to be much by way of leadership trying to reunify it. If anything, the leadership seems to be feeding off of the disunity. The same way certain leaderships did in China and Russia and Germany and Italy before. The Islamic world continues to be a problem, and with a reduction in overall global cooperation among nations, the Islamic world is being left more to itself. There should be expected to be more problems. And now you have Latin America as a much more problematic region than it was in 2000 or even 1990. All of these factors will contribute to create an environment where investors are going to say, I should have more of my wealth in gold and silver to protect myself from political disruptions and chaos and uncertainties, and the currency market and financial market and banking stability that stems from political uncertainties and disunity and disagreements. In Latin America, we had a move toward liberal democracies and open markets, and now the choice is fascist or socialist. Going back to where we were in the 60s. That's about what I have to say today. I just wanted to talk about these things because these are issues that will be important in the next week, the next month, and probably for the next 20 years or longer. Take care. We'll talk to you on Friday.